I am an Appalachian storyteller, but I tell all kinds of stories, and I'm free to adapt any story to any age, to any group of people. I tell from preschool all the way through senior citizens. The story I'm going to share with you today is from the book Ghost Dogs of the South, written by Randy Russell and Janet Barnett. This story is called The Watchdog. After World War II had ended and he was discharged, Corbin Forrest came back home to Harlan County, Kentucky to make his home. He got him a job in the number 7 mines of the Star Company, and he and his wife settled into the company housing. 6 days a week, he would get up, eat the breakfast that she had prepared, pick up the dinner bucket that she had packed, kiss her goodbye, and head on out the back door. He was always met there on the back porch by his old Airedale dog, Mike. Mike was named for his good friend, Mike, who had died during the big push at Normandy on D-Day. He and Mike would walk on in to the mine. When they got close to the face of the mine, Corbin would stop and unclip his watch from his belt loop, and he'd clip it onto Mike's collar. Mike would watch it until the shift was ended. He waited patiently at that entrance. The fellers took a liking to old Mike and decided he ought to be the company mascot, and they nicknamed him the old watchdog. Somebody built him a dog house. Oh, it wasn't much. It was just a few pieces of rough lumber and a piece or two of corrugated tin over it. But it did keep him in out of the rain and the snow and the sun when it beat down so hot in the summertime. Somebody got some paint and wrote in big white letters across the front of it, Mike. And Mike would wait there every day. And at precisely 12:14, he would jump up from where he was lying and run into that mine. And he would sniff around until he found Corbin. And then he would lay obediently at Corbin's feet while he ate his lunch. Corbin always ate a sandwich and a half, and he saved that last half of a sandwich as a treat for old Mike. Then he would close up his dinner bucket and give it to Mike. Mike would carry it outside and wait till the shift was over, and then they'd walk home. One morning, about 9:45, that old dog jumped up and ran into the mines. Well, there were 2 fellas guarding the gate shack, and one turned to the other one and said, "Wonder what's wrong with that old dog. His watch must be broke. It ain't dinner time." And the other one said, "Well, maybe he hears something." You see, they didn't hear anything, but old Mike did. He sniffed around until he found Corbin at the face of that mine. And he began to growl and to bark. And he'd run a little bit and he'd come back, and he'd run a little bit and he'd come back. And he'd grab a hold of Corbin's clothes and he'd tug at him. And finally, when he got his attention, he said, "What is it, boy?" And then he recognized a familiar sign. And he said, "Get out! Drop everything and run, boys!" And all 42 miners ran to the face of that mine. Some picked up their dinner buckets as they ran out. You see, they don't kid around about things like that in the mine. Once they were all safely outside, one miner turned to the other one and said, What are we doing out here?" And the other one said, "Well, Corbin said to run, and so that's what we did." One of the older miners said, "Well, boys, we better get on back to work before they dock us a day's pay." And he started toward the face of that mine, and Corbin said, "Wait, just wait a minute." And he looked down at his old friend Mike, and he began to reminisce about how he'd gotten Mike. Corbin was stationed in France during World War II. He and his good buddy Robert Smith were the cooks at the local mess tent. They prepared all the meals for all the boys. Times were hard. War was all around them. They were constantly aware of enemy attack. and anything, and I do mean anything, that could divert their attention for even just a split second was a welcome reprieve. One day, through an open tent door, this ugly old dog walked in. He was so poor that you could count every rib that he had. His skin was stretched so tight. And he had these big old long legs and big feet that didn't look like they belonged on them. And he had tufts of hair where he ought not have tufts of hair. He had one at his chin, kind of made him look like he had a goatee or something. And he had this big old bushy tail that kind of hung up over the back of him. But there was something warm and inviting about those big brown eyes of his. And all the fellas took a liking to him. They began to pet him and to play with him and to feed him. And in a short time, he was in fine health. All of them wanted him to come and stay with them at their mess tent or in their cottage or their tent. But he was happy where he was at. He wasn't about to budge. One of the boys got a blanket off of his cot and took it in and put it in a corner and made him sort of a makeshift bed there. One day, a boy got a bright idea. He got some rags and made a ball and rolled them up real tight and wanted Mike to come out and play fetch. So he rolled that ball to Mike, and Mike just kind of looked at it and left it laying there. He knew where he had it good, and he wasn't about to budge. So another boy got that ball, and he rubbed Spam all over it. And then he rolled it back to old Mike. And Mike just licked all that Spam off of it and just left it laying there. One morning, when Corbin and Robert were working in the mess tent, the sound of enemy fire was especially close that day. There'd been a supply plane that had come in and seemed like it had just drawn the enemy fire closer. Robert looked down at his watch and he said, "It's about 10 after 10. Robert said, "What's that supposed to mean?" I said, "Well, I kind of like to know what time it is when I die." Robert said, "They say you never hear the one that gets you." Well, maybe people don't. For at that very instant, old Mike jumped up from where he was lying and he run over to where Corbin and Mike were, and he began to growl and to bark, and he'd run a little bit and he'd come back and he'd run a little bit. And finally, Robert looked at Corbin and said, "You reckon we ought to go follow that old dog? Maybe he's got something he wants to show us." And so the two guys began to follow old Mike. He walked out of the mess tent, and when he did, he started to cross the field, and he started picking up the pace, and he started going faster and faster until he was at a dead run, and the boys had to run as hard as they could to catch up with him. And he went across this big field, and on the other side of the field was a great big foxhole. And he ran them right down into the middle of that. When they got there wasn't nothing there. Wonder what that old dog, wonder why he's doing it. There ain't nothing here. And old Robert took a cigarette out of his back pocket and lit it up and took a long draw of it, and he gave it to Corbin, and he did the same. And after they'd caught their breath, Corbin said, "Well, I guess we better get on back. It'll soon be time for lunch, and the boys will be there." And they stood up to go back, and when they did and started out of that foxhole, old Mike lunged at them, and he acted like he was going to eat them up or something. And he began to look up, and then he looked down, and he looked up, and he began to whine and to growl and to bark, and then he got silent, and the boys heard it. It was the familiar whine of a missile as it breaks through the air. And they hit the dirt, And right at that very minute, a huge missile landed right in the middle of that mess tent, right where Corbin and Robert had been working. And they got to their feet and dusted themselves off. They could see that that mess tent had been blown to smithereens. And what should have been today's lunch was scattered to and fro all over that field. Mike ran on ahead of him. For him, this wasn't nothing but a great big barbecue. He went to licking his lips and lapping his jaws. And he ate and ate that day till his old belly was strutted. Not long after that, Corbin got word that he was being transferred to England. He couldn't bear to leave that old dog behind. So he went to his company commander and asked could he have old Mike. And with his help, he made arrangements to send him back home to Harlan County, Kentucky, to his wife on Wallens Creek. She said that was about the best letter from him she'd ever gotten. She learned to love that old dog just as much as Corbin had. She said he wasn't no trouble at all, except, well, he didn't understand English. And she had to learn a few words in French in order to communicate with him. But other than that, he wasn't no trouble at all. Well, let's get on back to work, boys, the company commander said. And he started toward the face of that mine. And when he did, old Mike lunged at him and knocked him to the ground. And there he lay with a 50-pound dog on his back. And right at that very second, they began to hear a low rumbling deep down in the belly of that mine. And the intensity built until there was a huge explosion right where Corbin and those 42 miners had been working. The men stood there, silent and speechless for what seemed to be the longest time. The old foreman got to his feet. And he stuck his hand out and he said, "That's some dog you got there, Corbin." Some of the fellas had grabbed their dinner buckets on the way out and they just opened it up and gave it to Mike as a treat. Some of them scratched his old ears and petted him. Why, he was so happy that day he was a-wagging his tail, and he ate so much that his old belly about drugged the ground on the way home. Not too long after that, Corbin retired. And not too long after that, old Mike died. The young seasoned miners still often ask the old miners why there's a doghouse out in front of the number 7 mines of the Star Company. And they're quick to tell them the story about Corbin and old Mike and how he saved all those fellas' lives that day. You see, deep down in that mine, you can hear strange noises. Sometimes it's the moaning and the groaning of the timbers. Sometimes it's the shifting of the rocks. Sometimes it's the dripping of water. It ain't no wonder those guys tend to be jumpy. But it's said on certain days, when they hear a watch a-ticking, all activity comes to a halt. And they listen. And wherever it is that watch stops ticking, something will happen. A car will derail, a rock will fall, a timber will break, but something always happens. But by then, all the miners are safely outside. They leave their dinner buckets there that day. And thanks to old Mike, you see, they've never forgotten old Mike. And old Mike, he's not forgot them either. They aim to keep that watch a-ticking. Thank you.
Good.